I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary. The procession had already begun when King Charles made the command no sovereign was expected to give. Music faltered, ceremonial ranks froze, and an entire royal spectacle came to a sudden standstill. Moments earlier, Meghan's furious outburst had reduced Princess Anne to tears. Now Charles faced an impossible choice: protect the dignity of the crown or allow the public humiliation of his sister to continue unchecked. This state procession, a formal public journey in which the sovereign and senior royals represent national continuity, had been planned through central London with precision. Camilla waited beside Catherine as both women watched the ceremonial ranks hold position. William looked toward his father, while Harry stared at his wife. Meghan refused to retreat. She accused Anne of deliberately pushing her farther back in the procession order, the approved sequence deciding where each family member would travel or walk. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally held by the monarch's eldest daughter, tried to answer, but her voice broke. She turned away, pressed a handkerchief against her face, and trembled. Charles had watched his sister endure decades of criticism without losing her composure. Seeing Anne cry told him this wound reached far deeper. Harry reached for Meghan and quietly begged her to stop. She pulled away, convinced silence would mean accepting another calculated humiliation. Catherine moved closer to Anne, while Camilla warned Charles that the crowd would soon demand answers. William said nothing, yet his fixed expression revealed the danger. One accusation had cracked the family's ceremonial unity in public. A senior equerry stepped forward. The equerry, a royal officer responsible for ceremonial coordination, handed the king a logged account from the ceremonial office, the team managing official arrangements. It showed that Meghan's position had been changed that morning through an unsigned instruction. Anne had not authorized it. Harry's anger shifted into confusion, and Meghan fell silent as Charles read the entry twice. Charles raised his hand again and ordered every carriage, mounted unit, and marching rank to remain stationary until the instruction source was found. This was no longer merely a family outburst. Someone had manipulated the procession and placed Anne directly in the path of Meghan's fury. As Catherine guided her toward a private chamber, Anne caught William's sleeve. Her voice was barely steady, but her warning landed with terrifying clarity. This began long before today. And as the music died outside, the people behind the palace doors were forced to confront wounds that ceremony had concealed for years. Behind the gilded doors, the crisis was no longer about where anyone stood in a procession. It was about who felt betrayed, who believed they had been silenced, and who had carried resentment into a moment designed to symbolize unity. Anne's tears shocked Charles, but Meghan's fury did not emerge from nowhere. Between them stood Harry, caught between his wife and his family once again. Anne entered the private chamber and turned away from everyone. She had spent weeks reviewing routes, timings, and family positions because the ceremony honored continuity and the standards of her late mother. Royal duty, the public service expected from senior members of the monarchy, had shaped nearly every part of her adult life. Being attacked during an event she had worked to protect felt like a rejection of everything she represented. William offered her a glass of water, but the Princess Royal refused it. Her hands were still trembling. She told the future king that accusations of coldness no longer surprised her. Yet being publicly described as deliberately cruel had pierced something deeper. He listened without interrupting as she admitted that Meghan's words made decades of loyal service feel worthless in a single moment. Meghan stood in a separate corridor with Harry, fighting to control her anger. She told the Duke that the invitation had felt like a test of whether they were truly welcome or merely useful for appearances. Every placement mattered because standing at the margins would confirm her fear that the family wanted their presence without respecting them. Her husband understood that pain, But he also knew the Duchess had wounded Anne before seeking an explanation. Harry lowered his voice and asked why she had not spoken to him first. Meghan answered that, smiling through another unexplained decision would have felt like surrender. He reached for her again, and this time she did not pull away. Yet his sympathy was mixed with alarm. Someone had allowed his wife to believe that the Princess Royal personally designed the humiliation. Catherine suddenly remembered something that changed the room. In a documented account given privately to Charles, she described seeing an aide replace one page inside the ceremonial folder shortly before departure. That folder contained the approved timings and positions governing the event. The Princess of Wales had questioned the movement, but the staff member closed it, left the assembly room, and never returned. She repeated that detail to William, who immediately sensed its importance. Charles then received the revised order from a senior officer. The king discovered that Meghan had been moved 2 positions farther back, while a copied approval mark made the change appear to come directly from Anne. The monarch's sadness hardened into suspicion. This had not simply been confusion. Someone had engineered a personal collision. William demanded the original sign schedule from the ceremonial desk. An officer searched once, then again. The document had vanished. The missing schedule turned a painful misunderstanding into something darker, and the first clue led directly to a private rehearsal 3 days earlier. 3 days before the procession stopped, the family had gathered for what should have been a routine rehearsal. No crowds watched, no cameras waited. Yet inside that closed ceremonial hall, one exchange changed everything. Meghan questioned her assigned position and defended the established order, and a quiet disagreement hardened into open distrust. Everyone later remembered that rehearsal as the moment reconciliation began collapsing. Anne had been placed in charge by Charles, and she treated the responsibility with absolute seriousness. The rehearsal, a private practice used to confirm carriage positions, walking order, arrival times, and formal conduct, was meant to prevent uncertainty during the public ceremony. Every movement had to appear controlled, because a single delay could disrupt security, embarrass the family, and weaken the image of unity the event was created to project. Meghan entered with Harry after receiving personal assurances that both would be treated with dignity. She understood that they were no longer working royals, meaning family members who perform official duties for the monarch. Still, the Duchess believed their invitation signaled a genuine attempt at reconciliation. Her husband shared that hope, although he sensed how quickly old wounds could reopen if either of them felt pushed aside. The tension began when Meghan reached the placement board and saw her name behind several senior participants. She turned directly toward Anne and asked whether the position was intended as punishment. The Princess Royal held her gaze and calmly explained that the order reflected current duties, not personal value. Yet those words landed differently. The Duchess heard a sharper message beneath them. She could attend, but she no longer belonged near the center. Harry stepped between the women before the disagreement could deepen. He asked Anne whether any adjustment was possible, but she refused to rewrite an established order for emotional comfort. The Duke understood the practical answer, yet Meghan felt exposed. Charles entered moments later and ended the discussion, believing the matter had been settled. Instead, the king's intervention left every painful question unanswered. A silent message arrived. After the rehearsal, Meghan returned to her room and discovered a revised placement card showing her 2 positions closer to Charles. The card carried what appeared to be Anne's handwritten approval. Harry examined it and told his wife that the palace had reconsidered. For the first time that day, she relaxed. Someone had apparently heard her concerns and corrected what she believed was an insult. Anne later denied creating that card during a recorded rehearsal debrief, but her denial came after Harry had already presented it to Meghan as proof of a private change. The Princess Royal requested the document for examination. It had vanished. Staff searched the room, adjoining corridor, and briefing table, yet nothing was recovered. Without the card, one woman possessed only her word, while the other carried a promise she believed had been withdrawn. Morning brought the final blow. Meghan arrived for the procession and found herself returned to the original position. She did not see a procedural correction. She saw Anne publicly reversing a private promise. That mistaken belief followed Meghan into the procession, and when Anne entered the private chamber, there was nowhere left for either woman to hide. When Meghan entered the chamber, Anne was standing beside a long table, her eyes still wet, but her posture rigid. Charles remained between them, hoping silence might cool the fury. It did not. Meghan demanded to know why she had been promised one position and given another. Anne answered with equal force. She had made no promise. Then the mysterious placement card was mentioned, and every expression changed. Charles ordered the junior aides outside and allowed only Harry and William to remain. The king believed direct answers were the only way the procession could safely resume. Protocol, the established rules controlling royal conduct and ceremonial order, had failed to contain the conflict. Now honesty had to do what tradition could not. The Duke and the future king stayed because each had seen a different version of the schedule. Meghan reached into her bag and placed the disputed card on the table. She told Anne that humiliation did not become acceptable simply because the palace disguised it as procedure. Her voice rose as years of anger poured into the room. Unexplained decisions, distant smiles, and invitations that felt welcoming until the details pushed her aside. Harry watched his wife struggle, understanding her pain, even as he feared where her words were leading. Anne pushed the card back with 2 fingers. The Princess Royal said she would accept blame for every decision she had actually made, but she would not carry responsibility for promises manufactured in her name. She looked directly at Meghan and repeated that no private change had ever been approved. Charles heard certainty in his sister's voice, yet the Duchess heard another denial from a family she no longer trusted. William picked up the card and studied its approval mark. The prince had seen an initial countless ceremonial schedules, and one detail immediately troubled him. Her initials were reversed. Whoever had created the card had copied the mark from an older document without understanding the order in which she wrote it. He turned the paper toward Charles, and the king's expression hardened. Harry finally admitted how the card had reached him. In a recorded account given inside that chamber, the Duke explained that a palace intermediary had delivered it after the rehearsal. Such an intermediary is a trusted go-between who carries private messages without speaking publicly for either side. The messenger insisted Anne wanted to prevent another family dispute. Harry accepted the explanation because he desperately wanted to believe reconciliation was still possible. Meghan looked at her husband in disbelief. He confessed that he had never asked for written confirmation because the copied approval appeared genuine. Anne's anger shifted towards something colder. Someone had studied her habits, borrowed her authority, and used Harry's hope to prepare Meghan for betrayal. Charles walked to the chamber entrance and closed the door himself. The sound ended every argument. Nobody would rejoin the procession, he declared, until the intermediary was identified and questioned. But identifying the messenger would not be enough. Charles now had to decide whose authority could save the ceremony without destroying the family. The halted procession placed every second under pressure. Crowds waited, broadcasters searched for explanations, and senior officials urged Charles to resume before speculation overwhelmed the ceremony. Yet the king refused to move. He had seen Anne's tears and Meghan's rage. More importantly, he had seen evidence that someone had manipulated both women. Resuming without answers would preserve the spectacle while surrendering control of the truth. Charles held the final ceremonial authority, meaning only the sovereign could approve a change affecting the entire procession. But power did not make the choice simple. Security officers feared that stationary carriages could expose the family to danger, palace officials feared the silence would weaken public confidence. The monarch also knew that restarting too quickly would protect the state occasion, a formal national event, while abandoning Anne to humiliation and Meghan to suspicion. William supported the temporary suspension. The prince argued that a delayed ceremony could be repaired, but a hidden act of manipulation would poison the family long after the crowds departed. Camilla disagreed. She warned that every additional minute invited worldwide scrutiny and could turn a private rupture into a constitutional embarrassment, meaning a scandal serious enough to damage trust in the monarchy itself. The queen consort urged her husband to restore order immediately. Charles sat alone for several seconds. He removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against his eyes, carrying the pressure of being both sovereign and brother. Anne had rarely asked him for protection, yet her tears demanded an answer he could not postpone. When the king finally looked up, exhaustion had vanished from his expression. Resolve had replaced it. Harry stepped forward and asked his father not to treat Meghan as the sole cause of the crisis. The Duke admitted that her outburst was painful and uncontrolled, but insisted she had reacted to something designed to feel like betrayal. Charles agreed that the Duchess had crossed the line. Still, the monarch said the deception that provoked her might be more dangerous because it had used Anne's authority to attack them both. A sudden finding changed the room. The ceremonial office, the palace team coordinating official timings and positions, submitted a documented security report tracing the altered instruction to a temporary authorization code. That code had been issued from an internal communications terminal before dawn. No legitimate placement change should have passed through that machine, and the electronic record showed someone had deliberately avoided the normal approval system. Catherine then gave a recorded account of what she remembered. She had seen Camilla's deputy private secretary standing near the terminal shortly before the procession preparations began. The Princess of Wales had assumed the aide was delivering routine instructions, but now the timing felt impossible to ignore. Camilla stiffened as Charles asked whether her office had requested any change. She answered no. Charles ordered officials to bring the aide directly to the chamber. Minutes later, they returned with alarming news. The staff member had already left the palace complex. The missing aide left behind no explanation, only a trail of consequences that began striking the family before the procession could move again. After 47 motionless minutes, the procession finally began moving again. The music returned, the horses advanced, and the royal family presented the disciplined image the occasion demanded. Yet the order had changed. Anne rode beside Charles. Meghan withdrew from the procession, and Harry remained behind with her. To the watching world, it appeared ceremonial. Inside the family, everyone understood it as the first consequence. Charles resumed the event only after approving a simplified procession order, a reduced arrangement removing disputed positions and unnecessary movements. William helped prepare the change because the ceremony still carried national importance. Thousands had waited along the route, while security teams needed the stalled carriages moving again. The king placed Anne beside him as a public gesture of trust, making it impossible for anyone to believe he blamed his sister for the crisis. Meghan received an offer to travel in a later vehicle away from the disputed position. She refused. The Duchess believed appearing after the confrontation would turn her pain into public theater and force her to smile while the palace controlled the meaning of what had happened. Harry supported the decision, although he understood that her absence would become another powerful story. Harry watched the procession restart on a muted television inside a quiet palace room. The Duke sat beside Meghan, but struggled to find words that could comfort her without excusing the damage. He felt he had failed to protect his wife from manipulation, yet he also recognized that her public anger had broken Anne in front of the family and placed Charles under impossible pressure. Anne entered the carriage with reddened eyes and carefully controlled breathing. The Princess Royal had spent her life appearing steady during moments of national importance. But this time, composure demanded almost everything she had. Before the horses moved, Charles briefly covered her hand with his. He told his sister that she would not face the moment alone. She nodded once, and the king kept his hand there until the music began. A security report arrived before the procession reached its destination. In that documented account, officers confirmed that the missing aide had been located at a railway terminal carrying a private phone. The device contained messages sent before dawn discussing the need to correct the family balance before the ceremony. Investigators recovered the exchange through the palace communications log, giving Charles the first direct evidence of deliberate planning. One message exposed the cruelty behind the scheme. The false placement card had been created to make Meghan expect special treatment, ensuring that the original order would later feel like a personal betrayal. The plan did not merely change a schedule, it used her deepest fear against her, while placing Anne in the path of the explosion. William read the recovered message twice before giving it to his father. That evening, however, Anne made an unexpected request. She wanted to meet Meghan privately, with no Charles, Harry, or palace officials present. Once the uniforms, titles, and witnesses were removed, two wounded women would finally confront the truth beneath the spectacle. There were no aides in the room, no husbands waiting beside them, and no sovereign prepared to interrupt. Anne arrived first and placed the forged card between two empty chairs. Meghan entered moments later, still defensive, but visibly exhausted. For the first time since the procession collapsed, neither woman had an audience to persuade. They had only the damage between them and one chance to decide what it meant. Anne had requested the meeting because she refused to let palace officials translate her pain into a managed statement. Such a statement is carefully prepared language designed to control public understanding without exposing private conflict. The Princess Royal wanted no polished phrases and no protective distance. She wanted Meghan to hear what the accusation had done directly from the person who had endured it. Meghan had agreed only after speaking privately with Harry. The Duke told his wife that winning the public argument would mean nothing if the personal wound remained untreated. He did not ask her to abandon her anger, he asked her to separate the manipulation she had suffered from the damage she had caused. His words stayed with the Duchess as she took the chair opposite Anne. Anne spoke first. She admitted that being portrayed as deliberately cruel had struck deeper than Meghan understood. Duty had shaped her identity, demanded decades of sacrifice, and carried her through grief without allowing her to collapse publicly. When the accusation came, the Princess Royal felt that service become worthless in seconds. She had not cried because she feared criticism. She had cried because cruelty was the one intention she could not accept being placed in her name. Meghan lowered her defenses. She confessed that she had entered the procession expecting rejection before anyone said a word. The forged card appeared to promise respect and a small place of belonging. When that position disappeared, the Duchess believed Anne had offered kindness privately, only to withdraw it publicly. The moment confirmed every fear she had carried back into the palace. Anne then placed the recovered security report beside the false card. Through that documented account, she showed Meghan the messages found on the missing aide's phone. One woman had been designed to look vindictive. The other had been prepared to explode. Neither had been treated as a person. Both had been turned into weapons against each other. Meghan stopped at one phrase, correcting the family balance. She had heard those exact words during an earlier recorded private briefing about her return. Only a small group had attended. Her recognition helped investigators confirm that the aide possessed access to confidential family discussions and had borrowed language chosen specifically to provoke her deepest resentment. Silence changed the room. Anne did not offer instant forgiveness, and Meghan did not ask for it. Instead, the Duchess promised a direct apology without excuses. The Princess Royal accepted the promise, but Charles now faced another decision. Would that apology remain private, or would the king include it in the palace response? Their private understanding changed the family's direction. But outside the palace, a single image had already defined the crisis for millions. By nightfall, the world had reduced 47 minutes of private anguish to one unforgettable image. The royal carriage standing motionless while Charles leaned toward a tearful Anne. The photograph appeared across television screens and newspaper websites before the palace released a single explanation. Some saw a brother protecting his sister. Others saw a monarchy whose polished discipline had finally cracked under the weight of unresolved family pain. Broadcasters replayed the halted procession again and again. They focused on the instant the military bands stopped and mounted officers received the command not to advance. The procession carried national meaning because it presented the monarchy as stable during uncertainty. Its sudden interruption challenged that image, while the absence of an explanation allowed anger, sympathy, and speculation to compete for control of the story. The palace finally released a concise statement confirming that Charles had paused the ceremony after a serious internal disruption. A palace statement is an official message issued on behalf of the royal household to establish its public position. The documented announcement also confirmed that investigators had identified unauthorized interference with the arrangements. It did not initially mention the forged card, Meghan's accusation, or Anne's tears. Harry watched the coverage beside Meghan as commentators blamed her outburst for everything. The Duke knew the public had not seen the recovered messages or understood how his wife had been manipulated. Still, he could not deny that her anger had become the defining public image of the day. The Duchess listened in silence until one commentator called the incident an attack on Anne's dignity. Then she turned away, realizing that her pain had become someone else's humiliation. Anne received the photograph on a tablet and immediately asked for it to be removed. The Princess Royal hated seeing her private collapse preserved as national drama. Seconds later, she stopped the aide carrying the device away. Charles's hand rested over hers in the image, and that protective gesture changed its meaning. She no longer saw only weakness. She saw proof that her brother had refused to abandon her when ceremony demanded silence. One front page captured the public mood with brutal simplicity. Beneath the frozen carriage, the headline declared, "The King said stop." Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered as the official statement was read by broadcasters. When the documented announcement cleared any notion of changing Meghan's position, applause spread across the palace gates. The response was not merely support for one royal, it reflected relief that the deception had finally been named. Charles then authorized a second confirmation, stating that deliberate manipulation had occurred. The king protected every detail of the private meeting between Meghan and Anne, believing their fragile understanding should not become material for public judgment. He revealed the wrongdoing without exposing the reconciliation. The ceremony had ended, but accountability had not. Charles summoned the family to the chamber where the conflict began. Meghan understood an apology was coming. Harry knew consequences would follow. Anne prepared to hear whether truth had genuinely changed anything. The public had chosen its symbol. Now Charles had to give the family and the monarchy a definitive verdict. Charles did not end the crisis by pretending it had never happened. He ended it by naming each failure plainly. Meghan's public outburst had wounded Anne and damaged the ceremony. The forged instruction had deliberately provoked that explosion. Harry had trusted a message he should have questioned, and the palace had allowed secrecy to become so normal that deception could move through its corridors, wearing the appearance of authority. Charles gathered Anne, Meghan, Harry, William, Catherine, and Camilla inside the same chamber where the confrontation had erupted. The king wanted direct accountability, not another carefully managed performance. He confirmed that the missing aide had been dismissed and referred for a formal security investigation, a structured examination of whether private access and palace rules had been deliberately abused. Nobody in that room challenged the decision. William supported a new two-person authorization system, meaning no ceremonial change could become official without approval from two identified officers. Catherine argued that direct family notification must accompany every alteration, preventing forged instructions from creating another collision. Camilla agreed that her office should face the same controls as everyone else. The Queen Consort understood that protecting rank from scrutiny would only repeat the failure. Meghan turned toward Anne. The Duchess apologized without qualification for accusing her publicly and allowing anger to become cruelty. She did not blame the forged card, the missing aide, or years of resentment. She simply admitted that her words had caused pain. The Princess Royal accepted the apology, but made one condition clear: trust would not return through a single conversation. It would have to be rebuilt through consistent actions. Harry then spoke through a recorded family account, created to preserve exactly what each person accepted responsibility for. The Duke admitted that his suspicion of the institution had made him vulnerable to manipulation. He had believed the false message because it matched the betrayal he already expected. Charles acknowledged that palace secrecy had helped create that distrust. The monarch promised that future concerns involving his son would be addressed directly, without hidden intermediaries. Anne looked back at Meghan and delivered the truth neither woman could escape. Understanding the provocation did not erase the outburst, but it stopped the lie behind it from winning. The Duchess accepted that distinction without argument. She had been manipulated, yet she still remained responsible for how she responded. In that moment, accountability and compassion finally occupied the same room. Charles's decision to halt the procession no longer appeared weak. The king had refused to protect ceremony at the expense of his sister's dignity and the family's truth. William saw leadership in that choice. Catherine saw protection. Camilla saw the cost of allowing palace systems to operate without transparency, while Harry finally understood why stopping had been necessary. The procession exposed a wounded family, but it also forced honesty where silence had ruled. Anne left vindicated. Meghan left accountable but heard. Harry left chastened, and Charles emerged as a brother before a monarch. The crown endured because he stopped it long enough to confront what threatened it from within. The carriages eventually reached their destination, but the monarchy's most meaningful step that day had been Charles's decision to stop.